Thank you very much, Gahirlik, and I'd like to welcome the Minister to the House. Minister, the primary purpose, I know from your perspective, in the bill that you're bringing forward today is the establishment of the Climate Action Fund. And I think, like everybody else, we welcome the establishment of a Climate Action Fund. But there is a lot within that. And I know that in the debate that you had in the other House, in the Dáil, a lot of the focus was on what the Climate Action Fund might fund. The kind of the scope, the parameters that are given to you, that you give yourself effectively in its operation. And I would just note, I do think it is regrettable. I think there were some very constructive amendments thinking in an imaginative way about how that fund might be used that you didn't feel able to accept. But I would just note it's important because we'll see a lot of legislation moving rapidly. There is in fact no reason not to accept an amendment. Certainly when it's at the early stages, it wouldn't have added any further time or debate because the bill as amended would simply have come to us. It would not necessarily have added any time if constructive amendments had been accepted. So I think that's just important because we are going to be getting proposals, and if this is a collective challenge on climate change, we need to be able, and all ministers, not just yourself, need to be able to take positive proposals when they arise, wherever they arise from. In relation to myself, I haven't focused as much on the content of what the fund might fund, with one small exception, in that there's a part which speaks about the transition, what we hope will be a just transition, for sectors of the economy impacted by the actions that need to be taken. And I'm suggesting that it should be sections of the economy and society, because we're not simply an economy, we are a society. And indeed, even rural Ireland is not simply an economy or a number of business actors, it is a society. So there may be measures that might be taken through the Climate Action Fund that serve to sustain societies who are impacted, not necessarily solely focusing through the lens of the economy. It's incredibly important, but it's part of the picture. However, the part that I'm really concerned about, and I must, with due respect to my colleague in Fianna Fáil who just spoke, I have to say I had alarm bells when I heard the phrase, without this fund, the money would not be available for all of these necessary things. Let's be clear, these things are not a wish list. This isn't a bonus or a prize. These are the essential things we have to do. The Climate Action Fund may have a purpose, but these things are necessary things. And moreover, since we are speaking about putting things on the record, I'd like you, Minister, to put on the record the fact that the Climate Action Fund is not the limit of our ambition in terms of our spending and expenditure and in terms of all the projects we're taking forward. Even, Minister, in your own speech, when you talked about large infrastructural projects that we need in terms of climate action, in terms of biodiversity, need to be coming from every part of our budget. They need to be coming not simply limited to those who are selected through competition in the Climate Action Fund. I think the Climate Action Fund has a really important role in identifying leading edge, new projects, interesting ways of thinking, in getting different sectors on board, in delivering just transition. Those are really important things that it can really contribute to. But it cannot be the limit of our ambition. And in that sense, Minister, as you put on the record a wider sense of where the Climate Action Fund fits into the financial and fiscal ambition on climate action within this government, I hope you might be able to address, for example, the EIB, the European Investment Bank Fund that went through yesterday, which is not the hundreds of millions we might see in the Climate Action Fund, but in fact billions. Will the European Investment Fund, which has as one of its stated main objectives climate mitigation and adaptation, how will you be ensuring that that main objective, which sits within that fund, is reflected in how Ireland engages with the fund? In relation to the EU Recovery Fund, which is yet to come before this House and to be finalised, that is the fund that may include up to 500 billion in grants across Europe. How will we ensure that climate action, that biodiversity action, that all of those issues are reflected there? The conversation is not simply in our budget, it is in a European conversation now, and Ireland has a leading voice within that European in terms of the beneficiaries, the focus, the priorities and the policy thinking about the funding that we are putting towards Europe's recovery. So I'd like if you could reflect on that and where the fund fits in that wider fiscal picture. The bill is not simply about the Climate Action Fund, however. It's also an opening up of the National Oil Reserve Agency Act from 2007, and a lot has changed since 2007. At the time of that act, it was focused primarily on energy security, but now we know that we are facing climate crisis as well. There is a need to level up, and it is an opportunity to improve that legislation so that it reflects the reality. For example, Minister, a very simple thing that I'll be suggesting is that somebody with climate science expertise might be useful on the board of the National Oil Reserve Agency, so that while we're buying oils and other reserves, there's somebody who acknowledges how that fits. That there might be consistency with the fact that Ireland, yes, has an emergency supply that it must have, but is also thinking about divestment and also reflecting in our international conversations that, balance that has to be there where we are divesting while having this reserve. That we think about a sustainable energy reserve for the future. This is the area in sustainable energy storage, battery power, whatever it might be, that allows us to know that as a state, because in those conversations, there's often a tension suggested between sustainable energy and energy security. This is a chance to tackle that by having a sustainable energy reserve, making sustainable energy part of our backup plan as a state. The clean-up costs, and as my amendment in this area is ruled out of order, I'm going to highlight it, and Minister, you might address it. It's a very, very serious concern that as companies are leaving the oil and gas sector, they're leaving massive costs for the public. Rystad Energy has estimated that 250 oil and gas companies might go broke in America before the end of the year. Just one of them cost 40 million in a clean-up. Another one gave 15 million in cash bonuses to its executives and then 6 days later filed bankruptcy. That's why I'm suggesting we may need a further levy on the capital assets and the other assets of oil companies to ensure that they are preparing us for the cost of exit from oil and gas, that they are contributing not on the disposal in the day-to-day, not on what customers are paying, but on those assets so that we are prepared, because it will in the end often be the state who ends up doing a lot of the clean-up on this area. I also want to highlight the question of in terms of capital assets. When we look to that, how do we make sure that we're doing almost an audit of the infrastructure that we have in terms of oil and gas in the state, and how can we make sure that we really, you are able to be informed and have the figures and information you need in that? These are powers I tried to give you, Minister, in my amendments to the legislation, some of which I'll be able to press forward with and others which I won't. But I'd also like you to perhaps address the issue of how will this levy be reviewed? Because this is a changing landscape. We've seen it. Oil and gas companies are collapsing. We see that there's Brexit is around the corner. We know that this is a shifting landscape. So in terms of the 2%, and I know that Deputy Naughton made, I think, some constructive suggestions around giving you the power to move to 3%, for example, on that levy. And I'm also trying to give you the power to extend the levy in terms of what it might draw from. Could you perhaps tell us in the House how you will be keeping and monitoring that, and will there be a plan, for example, to open up the National Oil Reserve Agency legislation again? I mean, it seems unlikely. That's why I'm trying to get all of the powers into your hands, Minister, now, at this moment. Thank you.